The other side of investing process is represented by deal making. If decision making was positive, where positive means green light from the board of the AMC or from the board of general partners, another story starts, and this is the story of deal making. If you want to say what is deal making in a nutshell, deal making means to write and hopefully to sign a contract between the private equity investor and the company where they together find the right balance between the need of money of the company and the expectation of IRR and capital gain for the private equity investor. As you can imagine, to find a balance is not easy. That's the reason why we say deal making. We have to make the deal together. Deal making activity is based on three pillars in a certain sense, or three activities. The first pillar is represented by the concept of targeting. The second pillar is represented by the concept of liability profile. And the third one, the third pillar, is represented by the concept of engagement. Targeting means in which target we invest. Liability profile means what is the liability profile of the company in which we are going to invest. And engagement, what are the rules of corporate governance that qualify the presence of the private equity investor within the equity of the venture debt company. But however, let's start with the concept of targeting. Targeting basically is based on two different decisions we have to take, we have to negotiate with the company. The first one is the vehicle we use to invest, and the second one is the percentage of share. What's the meaning of the vehicle we use to invest? In many cases, the private equity investor is going to invest in the equity of the target, in the equity of the company, but also in other cases, the private equity investor could take the decision to invest not in the company, but in an SPV. For example, the usage of the SPV is mandatory if within the replacement financing cluster we run an LBO, but also if we decide to finance a company for an M&A transaction, we could decide to create an SPV. To create an SPV is not an easy decision, because using an SPV, it means also to decide to use debt. That means to convince the banking system to give money to the vehicle. So the two issues, the two decisions we have on the table is if it makes sense to run a direct investment, that means directly in the company, or to run a not direct investment, that means to use an SPV to invest in the company itself. If the decision was positive, so we selected a way in which we are going to invest, we have another issue of targeting, and the other issue is the amount of share. Amount of share means what is the percentage of equity the private equity would like to receive. The issue is not simple, because there are some aspects you have to avoid. For example, to have a small amount of shares, 1%, 2%, 3%, in many cases it's completely unuseful, because you don't have the tools to stay properly in the company. On the other way around, to have much more than the 50% means that you are the most important shareholder, you are the owner of the company, and not necessarily is a good position, because you need an entrepreneur is the owner of the company and has got the right motivations to drive the company. So the percentage of share is not easy to be negotiated and to be identified. But however, if the rating activity was done, we have to enter in the second area of activity, or the second pillar, which is represented by the liability profile. Liability profile means the liability side of the balance sheet of the company in which you are going to invest. If we discuss about the liability profile, we have to take two different decisions again. The first one is related to the concept of syndication strategy. The other one is related to the concept of debt issuing. What is syndication strategy? Syndication strategy means that the private equity investor is going to syndicate the business with another or with other private equity investors. It could sound a bit strange, because the private equity investor spent a lot of money to screen the market, to investigate a company, to evaluate the company, And why a private equity could give a business to another private equity investor? The reason could relate to the fact that there is a shortage of money for the private equity, or the deal is so big that the private equity investor doesn't have money enough to go on into the investment. And the smart decision could be, let's try to syndicate together with another private equity investor the business. The second decision is related to the concept of debt issuing. Debt issuing means to use a very hands-on approach and to help the company or the SPV to issue debt, where to issue debt means to issue bonds on the market, for example, for very large deals, or on the contrary, to negotiate with the banking system, loans, for example, mortgages, to finance again the company or the SPV. If the liability profile is done, we have the last phase, and the last phase is named engagement. Engagement means we have to set up the rules that qualify the presence of the private equity within the equity of the company. This last pillar is based on three different activities. The first one, categories of shares. Categories of shares means what are the rights that the private equity investor receive buying the shares of the company. One option could be to issue ordinary shares. This is very common. But what can happen, for example, the private equity want to receive preferred stocks, where preferred stocks are qualified by moral rights related to the share. For example, a right could be represented by a put option, where the private equity investor can sell the shares to the private equity. Another very common preferred stock is related to the possibility to have more voting rights. For example, if a private equity has got 20% of the company, but if stocks are preferred, this 20% of share could be represented by 49% of rights to vote into the board of directors. The second aspect is represented by the paying policy. Paying policy means the private equity has got to buy only new shares, or has to buy also shares of the entrepreneur. That means existing shares. If we come back to the lesson number one, private equity is based on financing. That means private equity is based only on buying of new shares. But in some cases, if the entrepreneur is very powerful or the deal is very important, what can happen is that the private equity has also buy shares of the entrepreneur to give back money, basically, to the entrepreneur. And the last decision is related to governance rules. Governance rules means to negotiate the functioning of the board to ensure, to enhance the capability of the private equity investor to interact and to drive the company. Just to give an example, number of directors, the possibility to have the chairman in the board, the scheduling of the meeting of the board, these are examples qualifying corporate governance rules.